Section 51 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. The Muscles and Fasciae of the Thigh, Part 2. 3. The Muscles of the Gluteal Region. Gluteus maximus, Gluteus medius, Gluteus minimus, Tensor fasciae lati, piriformis, obturator internus, gemellus superior, gemellus inferior, quadratus femoris, obturator externus. The gluteus maximus, the most superficial muscle in the gluteal region, is a broad and thick fleshy mass of a quadrilateral shape, and forms the prominence of the nates. Its large size is one of the most characteristic features of the muscular system in man, connected as it is with the power he has of maintaining the trunk in the erect posture. The muscle is remarkably coarse in structure, being made up of fasciculi lying parallel with one another and collected together into large bundles separated by fibrous septa. It arises from the posterior gluteal line of the ilium, and the rough portion of bone including the crest, immediately above and behind it, from the posterior surface of the lower part of the sacrum and the side of the coccyx, from the aponeurosis of the sacrospinalis, the sacrotuberous ligament, and the fascia, gluteal aponeurosis, covering the gluteus medius. The fibers are directed obliquely downward and lateralward, those forming the upper and larger portion of the muscle, together with the superficial fibers of the lower portion, end in a thick tendinous lamina, which passes across the greater trochanter and is inserted into the iliotibial band of the fascia lata. The deeper fibers of the lower portion of the muscle are inserted into the gluteal tuberosity between the vastus lateralis and adductor magnus. Bursae. 3 bursae are usually found in relation with the deep surface of this muscle. One of these, of large size and generally multilocular, separates it from the greater trochanter. A second, often wanting, is situated on the tuberosity of the ischium. A third is found between the tendon of the muscle and that of the vastus lateralis. The gluteus medius is a broad, thick, radiating muscle situated on the outer surface of the pelvis. Its posterior third is covered by the gluteus maximus, its anterior 2/3 by the gluteal aponeurosis, which separates it from the superficial fascia and integument. It arises from the outer surface of the ilium between the iliac crest and posterior gluteal line above, and the anterior gluteal line below. It also arises from the gluteal aponeurosis covering its outer surface. The fibers converge to a strong flattened tendon, which is inserted into the oblique ridge which runs downward and forward on the lateral surface of the greater trochanter. A bursa separates the tendon of the muscle from the surface of the trochanter over which it glides. Variations. The posterior border may be more or less closely united to the piriformis, or some of the fibers end on its tendon. The gluteus minimus, the smallest of the 3 gluteae, is placed immediately beneath the preceding. It is fan-shaped, arising from the outer surface of the ilium between the anterior and inferior gluteal lines, and behind, from the margin of the greater sciatic notch. The fibers converge to the deep surface of a radiated aponeurosis, and this ends in a tendon which is inserted into an impression on the anterior border of the greater trochanter, and gives an expansion to the capsule of the hip joint. A bursa is interposed between the tendon and the greater trochanter. Between the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus are the deep branches of the superior gluteal vessels and the superior gluteal nerve. The deep surface of the gluteus minimus is in relation with the reflected tendon of the rectus femoris and the capsule of the hip joint. Variations. The muscle may be divided into an anterior and a posterior part, or it may send slips to the piriformis, the gemellus superior, or the outer part of the origin of the vastus lateralis. The tensor fasciae lati, tensor fasciae femoris, arises from the anterior part of the outer lip of the iliac crest, from the outer surface of the anterior superior iliac spine, and part of the outer border of the notch below it, between the gluteus medius and sartorius, and from the deep surface of the fascia lata. It is inserted between the two layers of the iliotibial band of the fascia lata about the junction of the middle and upper thirds of the thigh. The piriformis is a flat muscle, pyramidal in shape, lying almost parallel with the posterior margin of the gluteus medius. It is situated partly within the pelvis against its posterior wall, and partly at the back of the hip joint. It arises from the front of the sacrum by 3 fleshy digitations, attached to the portions of bone between the first, second, third, and fourth anterior sacral foramina, and to the grooves leading from the foramina. A few fibers also arise from the margin of the greater sciatic foramen and from the anterior surface of the sacrotuberous ligament. The muscle passes out of the pelvis through the greater sciatic foramen, the upper part of which it fills, and is inserted by a rounded tendon into the upper border of the greater trochanter behind, but often partly blended with the common tendon of the obturator internus and gemelli. Variations. It is frequently pierced by the common peroneal nerve, and thus divided more or less into 2 parts. It may be united with the gluteus medius, or send fibers to the gluteus minimus, or receive fibers from the gemellus superior. It may have only 1 or 2 sacral attachments, or be inserted into the capsule of the hip joint. It may be absent. Obturator membrane. The obturator membrane is a thin fibrous sheet, which almost completely closes the obturator foramen. Its fibers are arranged in interlacing bundles mainly transverse in direction. The uppermost bundle is attached to the obturator tubercles and completes the obturator canal for the passage of the obturator vessels and nerve. The membrane is attached to the sharp margin of the obturator foramen except at its lower lateral angle, where it is fixed to the pelvic surface of the inferior ramus of the ischium, i.e., within the margin. Both obturator muscles are connected with this membrane. The obturator internus is situated partly within the lesser pelvis, and partly at the back of the hip joint. It arises from the inner surface of the anterolateral wall of the pelvis, where it surrounds the greater part of the obturator foramen, being attached to the inferior rami of the pubis and ischium, and at the side to the inner surface of the hip bone, below and behind the pelvic brim, reaching from the upper part of the greater sciatic foramen above and behind to the obturator foramen below and in front. It also arises from the pelvic surface of the obturator membrane except in the posterior part, from the tendinous arch which completes the canal for the passage of the obturator vessels and nerve, and to a slight extent from the obturator fascia, which covers the muscle. The fibers converge rapidly toward the lesser sciatic foramen, and end in 4 or 5 tendinous bands, which are found on the deep surface of the muscle. These bands are reflected at a right angle over the grooved surface of the ischium between its spine and tuberosity. This bony surface is covered by smooth cartilage, which is separated from the tendon by a bursa, and presents 1 or more ridges corresponding with the furrows between the tendinous bands. These bands leave the pelvis through the lesser sciatic foramen and unite into a single flattened tendon, which passes horizontally across the capsule of the hip joint, and after receiving the attachments of the gemelli, is inserted into the forepart of the medial surface of the greater trochanter above the trochanteric fossa. A bursa, narrow and elongated in form, is usually found between the tendon and the capsule of the hip joint. It occasionally communicates with the bursa between the tendon and the ischium. The gemelli are 2 small muscular fasciculi, accessories to the tendon of the obturator internus, which is received into a groove between them. The gemellus superior, the smaller of the 2, arises from the outer surface of the spine of the ischium, blends with the upper part of the tendon of the obturator internus, and is inserted with it into the medial surface of the greater trochanter. It is sometimes wanting. The gemellus inferior arises from the upper part of the tuberosity of the ischium, immediately below the groove for the obturator internus tendon. It blends with the lower part of the tendon of the obturator internus, and is inserted with it into the medial surface of the greater trochanter, rarely absent. The quadratus femoris is a flat quadrilateral muscle between the gemellus inferior and the upper margin of the adductor magnus. It is separated from the latter by the terminal branches of the medial femoral circumflex vessels. It arises from the upper part of the